Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I'm very, very excited and honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Emily Matula. Emily is an EVA certified instructor and flight controller in training at Leidos, where she is working on a contract with NASA Johnson Space Center for instructing crew and supporting staff about suit components, proper suit usage, and emergency procedures. Emily is a leading aerospace industry leader and has so much passion for space technology and development of spacesuits. I'm incredibly excited to speak with Emily on her exciting journey to where she is today, as well as her insights on how future spacesuits will look like and what we need to do to prepare humans to go to Mars and beyond. So, welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for taking your time today to inspire the next generation of aerospace leaders. I'm very, very excited to speak with you today.
Absolutely. No, thank you for inviting me. This is a absolute welcome surprise. And thank you for reaching out and taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that you've got a lot going on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. I honestly, when I read your background and especially in suit development, which has been coming a lot, a lot of topics these days, I was very excited to hear about your work. And so just to kick off our conversation, I wanted to start off by asking about your typical day. I know usually there is never a typical day, but I would love to learn how generally you like to structure your day and what your job currently looks like.
Sure. So I can actually split it up probably into three major sections. One section is the instructor part of it. The other section is the flight controller part. And then the third section is the look ahead or the exploration aspect. So underneath all three of these different sections, I house this under EVA or extravehicular activity focus. So any of those sections are looking through the lens of how do we get somebody out the door, quote unquote, and get them ready to do either science or maintenance, and have them be as efficient and safe as possible. So right now, I am training some crew, both assigned crew as well as some of our astronaut candidates, and getting them ready for their EVAs. So for the astronaut candidates, they are currently in a 2-year process, getting them ready to become, fully recognized astronauts. And so they right now are kind of going through ISS boot camp. They are learning everything about the ISS and they are learning everything about the different systems, including the spacesuit and how to maintenance and keep the spacesuit running for them. For my assigned crew, they're doing the same thing. They are learning all about the ISS, all about the spacesuits, but they've got a little bit more fine-tuned focused on exactly what they're going to be doing over the course of their mission. So you can almost think about it like learning about a specific country. You kind of learn about it in general, but if you're actually traveling to that country, you start learning more of the details and, how are you going to operate? How are you going to visit? Things like that. And so that's the same thing with our assigned crew. So they are learning some of like the ins and outs of things that have changed over the past year on the ISS. They are also learning about their suit in particular. So typically we have about 4 suits on station at any given time, and they can be a range of sizes. So the reason I say that is, some of their first tasks are going to be making the suit specifically sized for them, and then making sure that it works for them. So that's really what I do on the training side or the instructor side. On the flight controller side, I am still a flight controller in training. So what I am doing is I'm going through simulations. And so most of my day and the flight controller side is actually preparing for the simulations and preparing to get ready to basically figure out what's going wrong with a spacesuit or on the ISS. So for that, it is a lot of reviewing data, reviewing signatures, as we call it, from the spacesuit, and basically, practicing real-time calls, real-time troubleshooting execution, and figuring out how do you keep the crew moving in a particular activity, because crew time is so valuable. You want to keep them moving forward. And so it's part of our job to figure out what different questions we can ask in order to get information that can be helpful for us for troubleshooting, but also keeps the crew moving in their activity. So one of the first things that we train as a flight controller is how to do a loop scrub. It is a very common maintenance procedure. And so everybody on the system side, and that's my side, the suit side, learns how to do this loop scrub procedure. Then we learn about all the data that comes down during a loop scrub, and we figure out different common malfunctions that could happen or anomalous signatures, and then how to respond to them. So that's what I'm doing on the flight controller side. On the exploration side, there's a lot of really cool stuff coming up. So in the exploration side, this is what we call, the Artemis program. But we don't want to just keep it to Artemis. We want to expand it to really any surface program. So that's why we call it exploration, because it's really more forward focused. But in that program or in that focus, we are looking at not only the training side, but we're also looking at the flight controller side. And we are trying to integrate this under Artemis as well as Gateway and any future, lunar vehicles, as well as pressurized rovers and potentially, Martian habitats. So some of the things that we're focusing on right now is Artemis 3. So we have our vehicle already identified, we have our spacesuit identified, but those are still going through their design processes. So right now we're reviewing designs, we are meeting with the vendors, and we are giving them feedback on their designs. So we are giving them insight into things that they need to think about or things they need to consider. And we're trying to make sure that it is meeting our needs. So the reason we're going back to the moon is we want to look at volatiles specifically. So if you look at where Apollo landed, it landed mostly on the equator because this is a really safe spot to land. It was relatively easy to get to, and we had a lot of data on it, and we were able to watch it. So you were actually able to, see where you were going because it was on the bright side of the moon. And we knew a lot about it because we were able to make those observations. But now we're going to the South Pole. And this is a lot more dangerous, potentially more risky, but there is so much more science there. So there are these what we call permanently shadowed regions. They are craters, impact craters that were developed or basically formed over the history of the moon. And in these areas, they have not been touched by the sun since their formation. So that's why we call them permanently shadowed. So the thought is in these areas, there are these volatiles or these ices that have formed and that we want to collect. And the reason we believe that they're still there is once these ices or these volatiles heat up, they basically off-gas away. So if they're permanently shadowed, they stay below that boiling point, and so they stay in that solid formation. So we're excited to go there, collect this ice, and bring it back to Earth to study it. Because, as we say in our group, the history of Earth is reflected on the moon. So here on Earth, we have a lot of different processes, erosion, both from water and wind, that over time scrub away some of that surface history. However, the moon doesn't have that. So anything that has happened to Earth more than likely has happened on the moon. And so we can study the moon's surface in order to understand the history of Earth. So with that, we are trying to figure out how to build spacesuits to give us the best EVA possible, to make it easier for our crew members to what we say traverse or walk across the moon, make it easier to take all of these very valuable samples, and basically make it so that the crew member can have the most safe and efficient EVA possible. So that's kind of what my day-to-day looks like. In particular, and I know that this is probably where your interest lies, is part of my job is being a human health and performance liaison. So sitting from the operations side, I have a bunch of colleagues that sit in a totally different building, and they operate in the human and health and performance group. Wonderful people, lots of researchers trying to figure out how to keep our astronauts moving efficiently, but they have more of a medical focus. So they are looking at, the metabolic rate of these astronauts, looking at the injury potential of our spacesuits, and how to make sure that we have the right fitness program for our crew members, the right nutritional program for our crew members. And so what I do on my side is I help take that research and glean out the best results to bring back to my group and say, okay, in order to plan for our best EVA, we are going to have to make sure that our crew members are doing this fitness plan, or they're incorporating this nutritional plan. And so I kind of go back and forth in between and making sure that the two groups are communicating effectively. Because I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it seems like scientists and engineers speak totally different languages, and sometimes it's really hard for them to communicate. So the scientists always ask why, and the engineers always ask how. And sometimes it's really hard for those two phrases to, communicate effectively. So I sit in my position to kind of help that conversation and make sure that everybody is getting what they need.
Thank you so much for that background. I think it really put me into perspective of kind of what your role entails. And I think it's so exciting. I didn't realize that there was so much development constantly in these spacesuits because, when you look at these pictures of astronaut spacesuits when they do a spacewalk, it's always the same, or at least it appears to be the same iconic look. And so to see that there's so much research being done on these spacesuits to continuously relate or to help astronauts on their specific mission, I think is something I didn't realize before I put much thought into. So I think that's incredible. And so I have so many questions that just came into my mind while you were talking. And the first one, I think I'd like to ask about the spacesuits is, what are the main components of a spacesuit we need to continuously advance and innovate on to help astronauts in future short-term and long-duration spaceflight missions?
Oh, that's a great question. So I do want to make one thing clear. I maybe gave the spacesuit a little too much credit. We really haven't changed the design of the spacesuit since the beginning of the shuttle era. So these spacesuits that you see on the ISS spacewalks, they are the same design from the beginning of like the 1980s. So these are suits that are 30 plus years old in terms of design. In a lot of cases, components. Now, granted, every 6 years we bring down the spacesuits. They go through a refurbishment process, to make sure that everything is within its life cycle. But by and large, these spacesuits really haven't had a major update in their design. Now, granted, the way that the spacesuit was designed was to make it compatible with body sizes from the 5th percentile female all the way to the 95th percentile male. So we are trying to encapsulate a majority of the body sizes that were expected to be flown in the shuttle program and now the ISS program. But within these components, we have different sizes. So you can have a different size hard upper torso, you can have different size arms. Even within the arms, you can adjust them with cams. We have sizing rings to help, elongate or shorten, different pieces. So there's all these different mechanisms that allow us to help tailor the fit to a particular person. But we haven't had bespoke spacesuits since the Apollo era. We are going to continue to have these modular spacesuits with exploration, um, to try and fit these different body sizes. It is not within the program right now to go back to the bespoke, because we want to continue to try and use these future spacesuits for as long as possible. Now, you talk about the areas that we need to, update and look for advancement in. I would say myself, because I've been in a couple different spacesuits, and my colleagues and the crew members would all probably say the same thing, and that is the gloves. Especially in microgravity spacewalks or ISS spacewalks, you are using your hands to move across the station. So you are constantly opening and closing your hands throughout an entire spacewalk. Now, the suits are pressurized, so you essentially are creating, your own little space vehicle around you. So you have to pressurize your spacesuit to create a habitable environment. And so what that means is you are actually pressurizing your gloves as well. So you can imagine going on a spacewalk is like constantly holding a stress ball in your hands, and anytime you want to move, having to crunch on a stress ball. So you can only imagine how after 6 hours of that, your forearms are just dead. So one thing that we're trying to look at is how do we help the crew member with that opening and closing of their hands? One design update that they had for the gloves was to actually have them kind of in an already closed position. So if you look at an astronaut's hands in a space glove, they're not fully straight out, they're kind of curved already. Yeah, exactly. And so it's that formulation of the bladder material that kind of keeps it in this closed formation so that the crew member doesn't have to crunch down as far. It's helpful, but it's not as good as it could be. And so I'm looking forward to some of the technology developments that I've seen that have looked at like exoskeletons. I think that would be really cool to have some sort of like mechanical linkage help, like on the outside of the glove or maybe internally, to really help close the glove. I think there are also thinking about, medical parallels. I think that there are developments in, prosthesis that could definitely help us in, this gloves problem. And so I think there is an opportunity for biomedical folks such as yourself to think about some of these problems, and look at developments and what we're using today. I think that's something that sometimes the space industry doesn't take as much advantage of as it should. And so I definitely think in terms of like the glove issue, there are some areas where we could make advancements and we could help to solve those problems. I also know that more and more folks are looking at exoskeletons in general for spacesuits. And so I think that would be something interesting for like surface operations, in particular for like a Martian environment. Because I'm not sure if any of your previous guests have talked about, muscle degradation or bone degradation over long duration spaceflight. But there is a issue that a lot of researchers are looking at, which is how much are our bodies going to degenerate over the course of a long duration spaceflight, and how would that impact Martian operations? Because unsurprisingly, once we get to the surface of Mars, we're not going to want to stay inside and just hang out. We're going to want to get out there. We're going to want to do science. We're going to build things. We're going to want to keep going. And so there's this question of, so do we need an exoskeleton to help our crew members because they're not going to be able to stand up on their own, or they're not going to be able to lift things on their own? And so that's an area where I think learning from the medical community what we have now will help with that, but then also using some of those technologies to help microgravity issues that we have today.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really great point with the spacesuits. I did hear, I've always, I've read an article actually about the gloves and, why, there is a problem with them in space. And when you were talking, it just clicked to me, like, we have all of these robotics devices. And I wanted to ask you, how, how do you see robotics being potentially integrated into spacesuits? So maybe for certain operations, it's, through certain sensors that we can control certain things. I'm not sure how that would work, but have we ever thought or have we dabbled with the idea of using robotics or like robotic features and sensors in spacesuits? Or maybe they already exist that I don't know of. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this kind of intersection between robotics and spacesuits.
Yeah, right now, this is going to sound pretty blunt, but the suit's pretty dumb. So the primary life support system, or the PLIS, the backpack that you see on the spacesuit, right now is relatively dumb. So it's operated by mechanical valves and regulators. We do have, sensors throughout that are giving us information about our spacesuits, but it really isn't, controlling the operation of the spacesuit itself. And then when you look at the external tools that we have attached to the spacesuit, again, they're pretty dumb. So we've got different adjustable tethers, things with hooks, things to clip on. We have different sockets and ratchets and everything, but it's a lot of things that you would find maybe in a garage, like an auto mechanics garage, that are slightly adjusted for use in microgravity or use in space. Probably the most high-tech piece of equipment that we have as a tool is our pistol grip tool. And that is the thing that kind of looks like a drill. We call it the PGT, but we use that for driving and removing bolts off of station, off of pieces of equipment. So even that is, again, it's kind of dumb. It really only has like two purposes, and so that's really about it. So in terms of electronics and robotics, I think there is an opportunity for us to integrate more of those types of systems in. We do have a robotic arm. We have the Canada arm too, off the side of station, and it actually does a lot of repair and maintenance activities that are kind of every day. Usually when we have something that requires an EVA, it's because it requires some fine-tune adjustments that human hands are best suited for. But we try and accomplish a lot of things with that robotic arm because it's lower risk to humans. So why not? Why use all of those resources to get a human out there when we've got a robotic arm that can do the same thing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really interesting just to hear about the history of the spacesuit and, things that do need to be taken into consideration and how there is a lot of potential for updates to spacesuits. And honestly, the future of it is very exciting. And I'm curious to hear, how do you imagine spacesuits will look like in the next 20, 30 years? Do you think it'll be kind of the same as we've had in the past, or do you think there will be a lot of advancements? And the reason I ask is because I know a lot of commercial space companies like SpaceX are developing their new spacesuits. And I think it's so exciting to see how different, private companies are launching people into space, having astronauts do spacewalks, but more importantly, they're developing all of this new technology. So I'm curious, what do you envision future NASA spacesuits will look like?
Yeah, that's a question that I think you already kind of split up really nicely, which is, I think The spacesuit for a commercial entity, for a commercial EVA. So, if SpaceX has more, Polaris missions, and if Blue Origin decides that they want to start having EVAs with, their space station, I think those spacesuits are going to look different than the spacesuit, the future NASA spacesuits. And I think it's because of the environment as well as the operator. So, at least for the commercial side, they're probably going to look very similar to what we currently have for the ISS. Or they may be a little more, uh, how do I want to say this? Easier to operate. I think I've seen some designs where it's literally somebody, walks into essentially a tin can with a robotic arm out front. And what it does is it allows the person to basically leave the station, kind of fly around, maybe, grapple onto some stuff, and then, come back inside. And I think the reason that you see those types of spacesuits, and then maybe even the SpaceX spacesuit, where you have somebody on an umbilical and, going out the door and coming back, is the level of training that they are going to have before they go up into space is going to be substantially reduced compared to a NASA astronaut, that their mission is they're going to go do this thing, and part of it is doing this EVA to accomplish this task. I see EVAs, at least for the commercial side, being more of like an add-on or a extra activity that you could purchase as part of your package. So that there may not be as substantial training to go do those EVAs, and that's not an issue if you have a spacesuit that can accommodate somebody with that level of training. So I think the spacesuit is going to be a little bit simpler. It's not going to allow the person to accomplish as many things, but it's going to allow them to safely go out the door, experience, the vastness of space without any sort of, rigid containment around them like a large spacecraft, but then bring them safely back in the door and keep them relatively attached to station. I think where you're going to see a lot of the advancements are going to be on the NASA side, as they are going to these surface habitats, surface locations, potentially going to Mars, going to these different environments. And in a lot of cases, these higher radiation environments, I think that's something that we haven't needed to think about for a while. We did a little bit in the Apollo era, but even then it was kind of like, well, we hope they don't get zapped. But now we're starting to really think about, okay, well, how would we actually protect them, or how would we actually, mitigate this risk? And so I think the NASA side is going to be a little bit more advanced. We're going to be looking at different materials. We're going to be looking at maybe some of these exoskeletons, more sensors for sure, but also looking at things like heads-up displays and electronic cuff checklists, and the integration of a lot more, VR type systems. So we're going to start using a lot more technology in our spacesuits than we are today. And it's going to be interesting. I don't really know exactly what the form of this spacesuit's going to look like. I think it's still going to be, anthropomorphic, it's basically going to be human shaped. There we go. Can't say words today, but it's going to be basically human shaped. But we may have some exoskeleton type components to help the crew member move around.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a really important point, which is like the purpose of the spacesuit, and that differs greatly between, a NASA astronaut versus potentially a commercial astronaut. The duration differs. the mission purpose. I think all of that will, they all have different factors when you're considering spacesuits. And that's definitely, incredible point. So what is the purpose of the spacesuit and how does that differ the design for it? So I think that's a really great point. And another aspect of your job that you were talking about that I was really intrigued by was the emergency protocols, the emergency situations of helping an astronaut with their spacesuit up in the space station. I think a lot of times, I mean, I haven't actually heard of a spacesuit emergency on the International Space Station, but maybe you're more aware. Have there been these emergency situations? And if so, how did we navigate that process? And what are those emergency protocols look like if you are outside of the space station and something were to happen? What are, are astronauts prepped and trained to know what to do in that moment? How does that emergency protocol like work? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So we have had an emergency, spacesuit related emergency with a crew member that was part of EVA 23. So as an EVA flight controller, that is one of the first things you learn is what did EVA 23 look like? What was our response to it? Was it the proper response at the time? And, how have our protocols changed since then? So EVA 23 was when we almost had an astronaut drown in their spacesuit. And so essentially what happened was there was a system in the spacesuit that is responsible for removing humidity or removing water from the ventilation loop. Because as you're working hard out there, you're generating a lot of sweat, you're respiring a lot of humid breath, and so you need to remove all of that water. And so what had happened was that particular system failed. It clogged up with some contaminants, and that water that started to collect had no place to go. And so it collected, and ended up returning back to the crew member's head. And so essentially, what happened was, this water started to build up around the crew member's face. And so there was the potential that, this crew member could have drowned. Luckily, they stayed cool throughout the entire scenario. They got back into the airlock, they repressed, and then they were able to basically save themselves. But it was a learning moment because there were a couple things. We didn't realize that this was a potential failure of the suit. So it made us reevaluate all the different failure mechanisms and basically reassess like, okay, we didn't think this could happen, but now let's take a look at this again and see where this could happen again. It also made us look at different systems that needed to be integrated into the suit. So now we have what's called the helmet absorption pad. So it is essentially kind of like a diaper on the back of the crew member's head that is there to absorb water if we were to have another scenario. We also train the crew members, if you start to have water accumulation, what does it look like? What does it feel like? And then how to safe systems on your suit using your display and control module or that, panel on the front of their suit to start to shut down systems that could be contributing to this water accumulating on the back of the head. We also put together what's called the bold face. So this comes from the aviation industry, but it is a list of emergency procedures with minimal actions to save a crew member, to save an airplane, in the aviation industry that everybody must memorize. So a great example is if a crew member sees that their emergency backup oxygen is online, it's an immediate abort. You end the EVA, you go inside, you're done. We have other boldface scenarios. One of them being this water in the helmet type scenario. If a crew member sees, this substantial accumulation of water inside the helmet, that too is an immediate, end the EVA, get back inside, turn off all the systems that are necessary to try and save the person. So these are things that we and my group and I as an instructor teach our crew member and we practice them. So we practice them when they're doing their MBL runs or their neutral buoyancy laboratory runs. So this is the, giant pool that you see on TV and, in the movies and everything. So when they're doing their spacewalk practice, I basically will come on the overcom and just basically say, hey, this is what's happening in your spacesuit. What are you going to do? And they just basically have to practice exactly what they would do and try and save themselves and get back inside. So it's that real-time practice that we do over and over and over again until they get it perfectly and are confident in what they need to do. And then as flight controllers, we practice different anomaly signatures. So if we see a particular signature, we train, what is a high alert signature? What is, one that we need to watch? What's one that we need to say, okay, and the EVA, we're done. So those are all things that we practice, and we have very defined procedures, because I think that's something that we've all learned throughout this process is if you don't have these defined procedures, it can leave you guessing, and you don't want to be thinking during those types of moments. You want to just execute and get everybody safe.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I can't believe I haven't read about that particular situation or scenario of what happened, but just to know that there are this extensive training processes and procedures we have in place to protect these astronauts, but also learning from anything that happens, any mistakes that happen up there, and trying to fix that so it doesn't happen in the future. And kind of that trial and error process, the whole engineering design process with these spacesuits, I think it's very exciting, but also be very cautious with everything we do. So thank you for sharing a little bit more insight about those spacesuits. I honestly, it's such an exciting space, and I think it's going to, continuously advance in the future. That I'm excited to see how future space will look like. But as you were talking, I couldn't help but notice how knowledgeable you were about these spacesuits and about space, and how passionate you were to talking about these, different aspects of EVA. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what inspired you into the space sector. What was your aha moment that inspired you to pursue an aerospace career?
So I grew up in rural Ohio, and I think I probably have a very similar story as to a lot of your interviewers, but it's pretty much rural Ohio, going outdoors every evening, seeing the stars and everything. Um, I think 2 points that stick out to me. One being, being from Ohio, you learn about your state, you learn about the history of your state. And so, being the quote unquote birthplace of aviation, it is just drilled into you. We've got the Wright brothers, we've got John Glenn, we've got Neil Armstrong, we've got the most astronauts out of a state, all of that. So that kind of helps. And then also, my dad was a great proponent of space. And so I remember waking up for the December meteor showers. And the reason I know it was the December ones and not the ones that happened in August was, bundling up with like 4 coats and like 2 sets of pajamas and everything. And he would basically lay out this cardboard out in the driveway, and we would just lay on the cardboard and just like watch for however long we could stand the cold, sort of thing. But those I think are the two most impactful moments of what drove me to want to do aerospace. But I also think that you, as probably anybody else in this career, have had a moment where you go outside and you just look up and you just kind of stare, and you just stare at the darkness, and you start to see these little twinkly objects out there, and there's almost this pull. You can't necessarily describe it to somebody, but the only way that you can put it into words is like, I need to be there. And whatever that may be, whether it be you're kind of floating out there and looking at the stars, whether it be, you're traveling to there actively, but there's just something about I need to be there. I need to get closer to those little twinkly things out there. So unfortunately, if I ever get the opportunity to write the why do I want to be an astronaut essay, unfortunately it's probably going to be a pretty boring essay because it's just going to be full of, well, I just need to go there, and they're going to be like, yeah, okay.
And I think it's something so many students, including myself, can relate with. And I think that's what's so beautiful about space is it's this uniting force. Anywhere in the world, you can just look up into the night sky. You can see these beautiful objects. You start to fall in love with the stars, and it just attracts you to trying to be curious of what's beyond Earth, what is outside of Earth, and it draws you, pulls you to explore and to be curious. And just the fact that you took those moments, those special moments with your father, seeing those meteor showers, and also consistently pursued that path is incredible. And in this journey of yours, did you have any obstacles? And if so, how did you overcome them? A lot of times, students can be like, "Oh, she has the dream job. I mean, she's working on designing, incredible spacesuits, working with astronauts, training astronauts. It's an incredible job, and she must have had everything, set for her. But I'm sure in your journey, there must have been certain obstacles or challenges you might have had to overcome. So how are you able to navigate those challenges, and what advice would you give to students in overcoming these obstacles?
So I think an obstacle that sticks out to me, um, or maybe a point in time where I was very unsure of myself, and even to today, there are still times that I'm unsure. Is this the right path for me? Is this what I should be doing right now? So you never. I don't think you ever quite grow out of it. So I will say, even if you're feeling unsure of yourself right now, don't worry. Everybody is feeling unsure about themselves. But there was one time where I remember distinctly, I was like, I don't think I'm ever going to get there. And it was my first semester, freshman year in college. I had been what I would call a great student in high school. Great grades, was taking AP classes like I was supposed to, extracurriculars like I was supposed to, and, trying to set myself up for success in college. I got to college and it was just a totally different environment. And I remember getting my grades back um, from that first semester, and I was below the grade point average to apply for a NASA internship. And yes, I know it was my first semester freshman year, but you come away from that, and I remember distinctly thinking, I'm never going to work for NASA. I'm never going to step foot in a NASA center. They're never going to want me, and it was just a terrible feeling. And um, it was also a moment where it was kind of humbling too, where it was like, all right, whatever I was doing is not working. I need to change what I'm doing. And so it was really a make it or break it type moment where, I reevaluated how I was preparing for exams, for classes, things like that. And I readjusted, and I figured out what worked for me. I figured out, um, you know, how to how to basically bounce back from that. And so it still took time to, increase the GPA, and I eventually was able to graduate with honors. But what I'll say is, like, it still took time, and it still, took hard work to make sure that I could overcome it. So um, what I would say is, there are probably going to be a lot of times within your life, hopefully not as many, but there still be some times where, it feels like it is the absolute worst thing that could happen to your career, to your educational path, what have you. But it's really just a learning moment. And so I would say is, take take every setback as a learning moment, learning how to move forward, learning how to move differently. Um, I think is a great way to look at things because, um, you know, I always joke. I give myself a little bit of a pout time. Everybody needs a moment to just be upset about something because it's warranted. Those are, valid feelings. But then, you know, after you give yourself that pout time, it's time to dust yourself off and figure it out. So that's my piece of advice. Just keep going.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly inspiring. And as a student myself, I think a lot of times it's so easy to tell yourself that, oh, aerospace engineering is too hard, or oh, physics is too hard. Like maybe space is not cut out for me, or maybe engineering is not cut out for me. And it's so easy to get those thoughts in your mind. But when we hear it from individuals like yourself who've been through that, and you're like, hey, this is normal. Like it's okay to feel like this is very difficult, but if you keep working at it and you keep being persistent, you can overcome whatever academic or social problems you may have, and you may be able to come out on the other end successful. So just hearing that is incredibly comforting, especially for myself as I'm navigating college. And I'm sure every student who's listening can really relate to that. So really thank you for providing that comforting advice. I think it'll help a lot of us. And now that we're able to learn a little bit more about your work, a little bit about the future of space and spacesuits, as well as your journey, my last and final question for you that I ask every interviewee that I have on this podcast series is what final piece of advice do you have for a young professional regarding the pursuit of a passion in the space industry, in a STEM field, honestly, any career, a piece of advice you wish you had if you could travel back in time and tell a younger version of yourself, what would that advice be?
So I know you say one piece of advice, but I got two. So the first piece of advice probably would be, um, if you can't get a research, or sorry, if you can't get an internship job, try and get a research position, because it will still build your resume. It will still give you valuable experience, um, but it also may be closer to home. And what I mean by that is if there is a particular professor that you are interested in working with because you find their research really interesting, I recommend that you read a couple of their research papers, the most recent ones, to get an understanding of what their interests are, um, you know, over the last couple of years and maybe into the next couple of years, depending on their funding situation. But after you get a sense of, what they're researching and read those papers, it only has to be, one or two papers. It doesn't have to be their whole library, but just a couple. Try and set up time with them. Send them an email, say, hey, do you have office hours scheduled over the next couple of weeks? And the reason I say office hours is that specific time that is laid out for a professor to meet with anybody. And what it does is it shows that you are respectful of their time, but you still have an interest in talking with them. So after you go visit them in office hours, you can basically say, hey, I read a couple of your research papers. I think this particular topic is really interesting. Are you still doing research in this area? And can I join your lab in order to help you with this research because it's so interesting? Now, if they say, no, there's no room, that's where you change it and you go, do you have a grad student or a PhD student that would like an undergrad helper or a research assistant to help them in their research? There's always a grad student that needs a helper. As a former PhD student myself, I loved when undergrads would come through and say, hey, I'm here to help, because it would help offload my work so much more. It would allow me to go write my papers, go, distill data and everything. So it may not be paid, and it may be more like an extracurricular, but that is valuable experience that you can put on your resume, and it will help you advance the space industry as a whole. So that's my one piece of advice. try and get involved in research if you can, or some sort of student group, like team extracurricular. So whether it be like concrete canoe or SAE or something like that, something that helps you use the skills that you've started to build up in your classroom experience, but then start to actually use it out in the field. So actually putting it to good use, and then you can show on your resume, hey, I can actually use what I learned. So I think that'll help increase your ability to either get internships or to put you on a path to the career that you want. My second piece of advice uh, basically would be I totally lost it because I was really passionate about the first one. But more or less, I think the second piece of advice was, you know, you're going to think that you have the path perfectly picked out, and it's not. So even if you think I'm going to do this thing, then I'm going to do this thing, and then it's going to equal this, I would say that's not a really good formula, because if it doesn't happen exactly the way that you expected it to, it's going to be very disappointing. So what I would say, and I know lots of people have probably said this too, is do what interests you. And the reason why I say do what interests you is you are going to figure out a way that how your interests actually fit into the space industry or something larger. And an example that I have is I I went into my PhD research looking at algae and had no idea how I was going to integrate algae into spaceflight, but then walked away being able to do an entire PhD dissertation on how to use algae in spaceflight. And then it also equipped me with the resources to go down to Antarctica to do Antarctic research. So it's one of those where you can kind of back into how your interests will eventually help spaceflight. And so even if it's something like the medical field, or a background in biology or microbiology or ecology even, you can figure out a way how that can get you to space. So do what you love first. That way you're never disappointed. And then you can be creative on how that can get you to space.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible pieces of advice. I mean, the first one I can definitely relate with because coming into high school, I was always, very fascinated with space research, but I had no connections or no professors or teachers I knew of that were interested in space-related research where I could intern. And so I was trying to seek out opportunities, and I think I would write about like 50 to 100 cold emails to professors that I thought were had the most amazing research ever. And I would just read so many papers, reach out to the authors. And that's how I found my internship experiences that ended up leading me to have the background to apply for a NASA internship, to get into space biology and to build those credentials as I entered college. So I think that's incredible. That's a piece of advice that I can really vouch for. And I agree with you. I think a lot of students are like, how can I get involved in research? But I think there's always this, people seem to miss cold emailing, or they are nervous to email someone who seems to be so much more above them. But through my journey, and clearly yours as well, I think people are ready and willing to support younger students who are passionate about certain topics. And so all it takes is for us to just take that initial step to reach out to them. And more than likely, at least one of them, if not all of them, will agree to give you a research position. And the second advice as well, I think it's so easy to be like, oh, this is exactly what I want to do in the future. But also being open minded and open to new experiences is very important. Like this summer, I'm doing an internship on the kidney, and I honestly never knew a lot about the kidney before this internship. But when I got the opportunity, I was like, let's just do it because you never know. And I think the kidney is one of the coolest organs ever, and I didn't think about it before. So I think being open to new opportunities and new experiences is always so important. So thank you so much, Emily, for taking your time to do this interview. I know we went way past 30 minutes, but this was just such an exciting conversation for me. Just hearing about the spacesuits, to your work, to your journey, all of it was super exciting for me. So thank you again for doing this interview. I know I was inspired greatly, and I'm sure every single student and young professional who's listening will be inspired as well. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.